Welcome to the Alex Dynasty Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan McNamara. We're doing another YouTube video here of our Thursday trades. So again, you can go ahead and get all our podcasts over at analyticsdynasty.com. We're doing one every day. This is one of the podcasts we do each week as a trade show. So you can go ahead and use the promo code TDF for 21% off. TDF, Tour de France, for 21% off. One last week of that. And you can get all our podcasts and stay with us. If you're over here on the subscriber side, go ahead and check out the YouTube side. Give us a like, a follow, a share. Do all that and give us a hand over there. So if you want, you can see my face in my office while we're doing this. So go ahead and check all that out. All right, here we go. I found this one interesting right off the jump. Again, using all of our trades out of the trade database. Will Levis for a 2025 first. This is a best ball, it's a super flex. All these are super flex. Like the general rule of thumb on trades involving players and picks in the offseason is if you're going to trade a first for a top for a player, you better be getting a top 30 asset in return. The answer to that question is unequivocally no, right? You're not getting a top 30 asset in Will Levis. One of the things that I struggle with a bit in this sort of rule that I've made for myself so I don't make mistakes on trading future picks is like when to kind of break the rule. One of the ways that I would kind of think about it as well is like, okay, well, what am I going to get, right? One of the traps I fall into is, okay, well, what am I going to get with that first, right? Am I going to get a first-round quarterback or a starting quarterback? Like, is that something that I'm going to get? And you start kind of playing this game with yourself, like, well, maybe Will Levis is better than what I will get with that pick. I think that's flawed, right? And this is one of the reasons why I kind of have the top 30 asset rule in place for me. Right? A lot of the rules, a lot of the analytical takeaways from AOD research in the past, the Dynasty Team Building Guide, all of those kind of takeaways are meant to be guardrails so you don't careen your team off a cliff, right? And this is one of those pattern situations where you can look at, see, okay, here's guardrail set up. Because the problem is you start kind of projecting ahead on 2025 draft class, which I think a lot of people are going to do, talk about the strengths, the weaknesses, no quarterbacks, all that stuff. We don't know how it's going to turn out, right? Burrow and Kyler Murray kind of came from depths, and there could be a guy like that this year who turns into a really good 101, and that doesn't. We don't know. Jaden Daniels wasn't expected to be a top 5 pick this time last year. So right, those things happen every year. So and I think the ability to predict what's going to happen in the draft, we don't do a good job of that like in January, let alone in August, right? So I'd be careful on that. And the other thing too is like the pick's liquid and very valuable. And so while you may sit here and think, well, hey, I don't know if I'm going to get a starting quarterback with this random future first a year from now, that's not really the equation, right? The equation is, can you use that pick at some point between now and then to get something better than Will Levis, right? Is the pick better liquid? Is the pick better in savings? Is the pick better as an asset on your asset sheet than it is with Will Levis? I think that it is. Now, Will Levis last year started really well. Like, Will Levis is the kind of, you hear primacy and recency. You remember the first thing that happened and the last thing that happened to you. You hear that as a psychological phenomenon very often. Will Levis is kind of the king of that, right? Like, he had a 4-touchdown, 238-yard game against Atlanta in Week 8. He had 2 big-time throws in that game, 1 turnover-worthy play, and then from then on, he had a total of 4 touchdowns, right, in the final weeks 9 through 17. He missed week 16 with an injury. I think it was this week 17 and 18 as well. So there was some injury stuff there that happened for him, but he threw half of his touchdowns in his first game last year. Right, so I think people have a better perception of him than he did kind of perform. He's going to throw the ball into harm's way. and kind of live the good and the bad of that type of quarterback, right? You look at last year, 5.9% big time throw rate, 4.5% turn-worthy play rate. Like, you got to rein that in a little bit. Like, you like the good. The 5.9 is really good. The cost of that is really high, right? So, for example, like, when I was recording the Tua segment of my Miami Dolphins, I was like, yeah, he had a 6, but it was a 3.5, and that's a high, his turn-worthy play rate was 3.5 with a 6 big-time throw rate. Like, that's still kind of a high turn-worthy play rate. Like, Will Levis says, hold my beer and watch this. So that's kind of the concern that I have about Levis. Again, there's a reason that he fell in the draft, right? The pressure to sack rate stuff is still too high at 21.5%. And I think he's going to get himself in trouble. So all of that, right? I have concerns about that profile. Again, he's 25, which is already like, in the age range of, like, if he were to hit, like, that's the average first hit for a one-hit wonder guy. So, you start already kind of putting yourself along lines of where he's at. Yeah, I will say this about the offense. It's a good offense for him to be in. I don't think it's necessarily a great supporting cast, but it's the type of supporting cast that will reveal whether or not Will Levis can play. And I think that's good, right? Where you don't know about that for guys like Drake May, right? Or, we've had, guys like Zach Wilson or Darnold in the past, right? There's problems there. I don't think you necessarily have that concern with Will Levis. All right, let's look at some other stuff here in the trade market. You got Jordan Addison and Quentin Johnston for a 2025 second, 302, and a 2025 fourth. So a third this year, a second, and a fourth next year. It feels like a bailout. And I kind of see how the math on this goes. Hey, you get a third for Quentin Johnston, you get a second and fourth for Addison, and do it. I think it's fair. I don't know. It feels like you're kind of bailing out on those two guys and selling at an extreme low. I don't know. I think I'd probably hold them, would be my thought, then just kick the can. Again, it's first-round draft pedigree. I don't know if you're going to get that at 302 or in the future second. Right? You're already taking a loss on all that. I would probably wait for a rebound other than sell low. This one's really interesting, and I'm surprised that it happened. It's Aiden O'Connell for Chuba Hubbard. And this is a good example of something that I've been seeing a little bit. This is a super flex league. It's actually not tight end premium. But this is something I've been seeing a little bit more of, how it's easier to get quarterbacks in super flex tight end premium than it is to get tight ends. And this is an example of that. Again, basically a backup injury away running back for a potential at a starting quarterback. Again, Aiden O'Connell's not going to change your life, but it becomes hard to get tight ends in those formats, and seeing a guy like Aiden O'Connell traded for a backup running back is interesting. Dalton Schultz for a second. It's non-tight end premium. I think Dalton Schultz for a second makes a lot of sense. You turn a tight end who there's not a ton of difference between him and a bunch of different guys in that range. You don't exactly know how Nico Collins, Tank Dell, Stefon Diggs kind of all fitting together, what that does for Dalton Schultz. It probably leaves him with a lesser opportunity than he's probably had. Again, I don't think he's a good player. I don't think he's a great player, a huge difference maker. You get a second, right? You can kind of pocket that and then, redeploy that when you need to. You can even go back to the tight end market. Maybe you get an opportunity to pivot to a guy like Ingram or Joku when it's more advantageous for you to do so. Right, I think that kind of playing that timeline stuff with a pick like this and you can kind of arbitrage all that stuff, that's a really good process. So I really like that Dalton Schultz trade, and I think it's a good example of like kind of how to arbitrage a player. Let's keep going down the list here. I don't like this deal. I think it's an instructive deal, and I think it's the type of deal that I think gets people in a lot of trouble. And my research has kind of indicated this. So it's T. Higgins, Devontae Adams, and James Cook for Malik Neighbors and Zach Moss. Now, if you look, like I think if you went out into the trade market or you went out into Twitter and said, hey, what's your take on this type of deal? I think people are going to fall in love with Neighbors being the best player in this deal. The problem is that you're giving up a lot of outs, right? And when you look at first-round wide receivers, when you look at top 10 guys, maybe about 65% hit rate. Again, they're not bulletproof. Right? I think people think like 75% chance of being a star, right? It ain't that. It's maybe like 10 to 20% chance, depending on how you want to measure it. Like, it's not that high. And I think that people overstate that. And so when you kind of look at the other side of this deal, it doesn't have really like a star quality in there, but it has a lot of guys that could be difference makers, right? Or you could put out a contending team. You just think about like, let's take a good dynasty team that's got, maybe a couple of good quarterbacks, right? A contending tight end space, right? And then you kind of take these, this player, you take these players of Higgins and Cook and Adams out of it and plop Neighbors in, and you're like, all right, well, I'm just taking the lid off of that this year, I think, right? I'm lowering the floor on that as well. Like, that's a lot to add back. I mean, you're talking about probably something along the lines of like maybe a win to a win and a half loss this year on average. Like, that's a lot. That's a lot to lose. And I think that too often dynasty GMs do themselves a disservice by going out and trading for rookies, right? This is a really good example of you shouldn't trade up and sort of package up for rookie wide receivers because it's so much risk. So while I like Neighbors, I think he's a really interesting player. He's got a good profile. I think it's too much to potentially give all of these players up in him. Now, if you wanted to go and pivot off of Higgins, right, you could kind of do that. Like, there's other ways to do this, right? Like, add Higgins and add something to Higgins and kind of pivot to a guy like Nico Collins if you want. Like, pivot. If there's ways to pivot off of these players, but there's ways to pivot off of James Cook and Devontae Adams. Right? But that doesn't mean you got to include all of them. Like, this 3-for-1 productive players for rookie. That's a dangerous road to go down. By the way, I thought maybe this would win on like keep trade cut with the Neighbor side. It did lose, thankfully. It restores my faith for at least a couple of minutes in those sites, but it's too much to give up in my opinion, and I don't like the shape of the deal. It's a very much win the off-season deal. It's a dynasty bikini season deal, and you got to be careful on that. All right, next up here we've got Stefon Diggs for Isaiah Likely. This is tight end premium. It's actually a good use of Likely. I've got a couple of Likely spots where I have Likely. Again, he's basically the backup tight end for Mark Andrews in an offense that's good. I don't think it's like going to be Gronk, Hernandez, Patriots era 2 tight end. Right? That's not something that we usually see a ton of. And I think Likely is very much going to be kind of on that like developmental, like will he, won't he kind of free agent track, more so than he's going to be like a difference maker. And you take Likely and you get Diggs. Again, you're buying low on Diggs, I think. And, I think that's a really good use of Likely. I've got Likely in a couple of spots where I'm just kind of sitting on him and I'm trying to upgrade a tight end. It's not really working. They're going to try something like this where I go out and just kind of increase out the depth of my lineup with a receiver, and maybe it's a non-premium position, but I don't think he's a premium asset, and he's not treated like that. And the more I've kind of held for that, like I haven't really got what I've hoped in return. All right, that's going to put a wrap here on the YouTube side of this. Again, go subscribe at analyticsdynasty.com. You can get all our podcasts, including the second half of this one, over at AOD. Analyticsdynasty.com, TDF as the promo code for the rest of the week. And until next time,